The saleswoman's lips pressed together, but she didn't respond. Instead, she looked to the first officer, as if expecting him to take control. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Son, do you have any ID on you?" Marcus nodded and slowly reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his school ID, his fingers brushing against the officer's for just a second before he pulled away. The officer looked at it, then at Marcus. Something in his expression softened, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage already done. Meanwhile, outside the store, more people had gathered, some holding up their phones. The store manager had come out from the back, his eyes wide as he took in the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp. Before anyone could answer, something unexpected happened, something that no one, not even Marcus, saw coming. The store manager's voice cut through the heavy silence, and everyone turned to look at him. He was a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed suit, his expression shifting between confusion and concern. His eyes landed on Marcus, then the officers, and finally the saleswoman, who looked uncomfortable under his gaze. "I'd like to know that too," the female officer added, still holding Marcus's school ID. From what I can tell, this young man was just shopping. The saleswoman hesitated, her confidence slipping. She opened her mouth as if searching for an excuse, but the weight of the growing crowd outside the store, the flashing phones capturing every second, made her falter. I just thought he looked suspicious," she finally muttered, but her voice wasn't as firm as before. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had stayed quiet long enough, but hearing her struggle to justify her actions made something in him snap. "Suspicious how?" he asked, his voice steady now. "Because I walked in here alone. Because I didn't immediately buy something. Or was it because I don't look like the people you expect to shop here?" The store manager's eyes widened slightly, and a few of the customers murmured amongst themselves. The tension in the room thickened, but Marcus wasn't done. "I worked all summer to save up for this gift," he continued, his voice louder now. "I came in here to buy something special for my mom. But instead of treating me like a customer, you called the police on me." The saleswoman's face turned red, but she said nothing. The store manager sighed and turned to her. "Is this true? Did you call the police just because he was browsing?" She didn't answer right away. The security guard, who had been standing by quietly, shifted uncomfortably. He had been quick to follow her lead, but now it seemed like he wasn't so sure. I just thought," the saleswoman stammered, but the manager held up a hand, cutting her off. He took a slow breath, then looked at the officers. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding," he said carefully. The male officer nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. The female officer, still holding Marcus's ID, turned to him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice quieter now, meant just for him. Marcus swallowed hard, his hands still clenched at his sides. Was he okay? He wasn't sure. He had come here to do something good, something simple. But instead, he had been humiliated, treated like a criminal in front of strangers. Outside, the crowd was growing. More people were stopping to see what was happening, and the energy was shifting. Some customers inside had started speaking up, questioning what they had just witnessed. A woman in a beach coat turned to Marcus. "I saw the whole thing," she said. "This isn't right." Marcus's heart pounded. For the first time since the police had arrived, he felt something other than fear. He felt anger. But before he could respond, someone stepped forward from the crowd, their presence changing everything in an instant. The store felt like it was holding its breath. Every eye was on Marcus, the officers, and the store employees. But it was the crowd outside that was shifting the energy in a way no one could ignore. Phones were raised, voices murmured, and tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. Then a voice rang out. "I recorded everything," said a young woman from the crowd. She stepped forward, holding her phone up. Everyone saw what happened. Marcus's heart pounded as the woman's words settled over the room. The store manager's jaw tightened. The saleswoman's face drained of color. The security guard looked like he wanted to step back, to disappear into the background, but it was too late. The truth had already spread beyond the walls of the store. The male officer shifted uncomfortably and glanced at his partner. The female officer, still holding Marcus's school ID, nodded at the young woman. "Would you be willing to share that footage?" she asked, her voice calm but serious, and somehow, in the end, the truth had still come out. The woman from corporate turned to him one last time. "Marcus, I know an apology isn't enough, but I promise you this will be handled." He nodded, still processing everything. He wasn't sure what handling it meant, but at least now, people were listening. Outside, the crowd had started to break apart, the energy shifting from anger to something else, something like relief. But as Marcus took one last look at the store, he couldn't shake one final thought. Today, they had been caught. But how many times had this happened before? And how many times would it happen again? Marcus stepped outside, the weight of everything still pressing on his chest. The crowd had begun to disperse, people murmuring amongst themselves, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. Some still had their phones out, scrolling through social media, watching the story spread in real time. He took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air hit his skin. The officers had left, the security guard had backed away, and the store manager stood inside, rubbing his temples as if trying to figure out how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The woman from corporate was still there, speaking in hushed but firm tones to another employee, likely making sure the store took immediate action. But Marcus, he was just standing there, trying to process what had just happened. He had come in to buy something special for his mom, something to make her smile. Instead, he had been treated like he didn't belong, like he was a problem that needed to be removed. And yet, somehow, by the end of it, the truth had come out. Not because he had fought harder than he should have had to, but because people had been watching. Because the world had refused to look away. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You all right?" Marcus turned to see the woman who had first recorded the incident standing beside him. She had tucked her phone away now, but her expression was still serious, still searching. "I don't know," Marcus admitted honestly. "I guess I should feel better now, but I don't know." She nodded like she understood. "What happened in there wasn't okay," she said. "But you didn't just stand there and take it. You spoke up, and people listened." Marcus let that sink in. He had spoken up. And for once, people had actually listened. The woman from corporate stepped outside just then, her eyes scanning the area before landing on him. She walked over, her posture still holding that same authority. But this time, her voice was softer. "Marcus, before you go, I want to make sure you know that this isn't over on our end," she said. "I know you probably don't trust a company to fix something like this, but I mean it. This isn't going to be swept under the rug." Marcus searched her face, looking for anything that suggested this was just damage control. But there was something in her expression that told him she really did mean it. He nodded. "I hope so." She gave him a small, understanding smile. "And for what it's worth, your mom's lucky to have a son like you." Marcus felt something in his chest tighten. He had almost forgotten why he had come here in the first place. He looked down at the money still clutched in his hand. After everything, he still hadn't bought a gift. The woman seemed to notice. "Go somewhere else," she said, as if reading his mind. somewhere that actually deserves your business. Marcus exhaled, then nodded again. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the store, leaving it behind. As he made his way down the street, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. What had happened today would stick with him forever. But he also knew this wasn't just about him anymore. His story had already left the store. It was out in the world now, and people were paying attention. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something would finally change. Imagine walking into a store, excited to buy something special, only to be treated like a criminal the moment you step inside. That's exactly what happened to 17-year-old Marcus, a high school senior with big dreams and a kind heart. He had saved up for months to buy his mom a beautiful necklace for her birthday. But instead of being greeted with smiles, he was met with suspicious stares. And before he even had a chance to browse, the store staff had already made up their minds about him. It started the second he walked in. The security guard at the entrance, a tall man with a stiff posture, narrowed his eyes as Marcus entered. A saleswoman behind the glass counter whispered something to her coworker, and they both kept their eyes locked on him as he moved through the store. At first, Marcus didn't notice. He was too busy admiring the sparkling jewelry under the bright lights, imagining the look on his mom's face when she opened her gift. But then he felt it, the heavy weight of judgment in the air. The way the employees avoided eye contact but never stopped watching him. When Marcus finally approached the counter, ready to ask about a necklace he had spotted, the saleswoman took a step back. Her voice was sharp, her expression cold. "Can I help you?" she asked, but there was no warmth in her tone. Marcus smiled, trying to be polite. "Yeah, I'd like to see that silver heart pendant, please." Instead of showing him the piece, she hesitated, glancing at her coworker. "Do you even have money for something like this?" she asked, her words cutting deeper than she probably realized. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He wasn't expecting that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the neatly folded bills he had worked so hard to save. "Yes, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice steady, though he could feel his face burning. But it didn't matter. She had already made up her mind. She turned away and muttered something under her breath. A moment later, Marcus heard a soft click. She had pressed the silent alarm. Seconds later, the security guard moved in. "We've had complaints about suspicious activity," he said, his voice low but firm. Marcus froze. Suspicious? He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't even touched the jewelry. "I just wanted to buy a necklace," he said, his heart pounding. But it was too late. The sound of sirens filled the air, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass cases. Someone had called the cops. What happens next will leave you speechless. Because when the police arrived, the situation took an unexpected turn, one that no one, not even Marcus, saw coming. Stay tuned to find out how one simple shopping trip turned into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The flashing lights painted the store in streaks of red and blue, reflecting off the glass display cases. Marcus felt his chest tighten as two officers stepped inside, their presence commanding the attention of everyone in the store. The saleswoman, who had moments ago dismissed him, suddenly looked concerned, but not for Marcus. She gestured toward him quickly, whispering something to the officers, who nodded before turning their eyes on him. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in fear. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a suspect. Customers had stopped shopping, their curious eyes darting between him and the police. He heard the muffled sound of someone's phone recording. Maybe they had seen what happened. Maybe they understood that this wasn't right. One of the officers, a tall man with sharp features, took a step forward. "Son, we got a call about suspicious behavior," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you mind telling us what's going on?" Marcus swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just wanted to buy a necklace for my mom," he said, holding up the neatly folded money in his hand. His voice was clear, but there was a slight tremble in it. "That's all." The officer looked at the saleswoman, who crossed her arms. He was acting strange, she insisted, kept looking around like he was up to something. Marcus let out a breath, shaking his head. "I was looking at the jewelry," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "That's what people do in a jewelry store, right?" The second officer, a woman with kind eyes, seemed to pick up on something. She glanced at Marcus, then at the saleswoman. "Did he take anything?" "Try to leave without paying?" she asked. The saleswoman hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but nothing," the female officer said, cutting her off. "You called us on a kid just for looking at jewelry." The room fell silent. The customers, the employees, everyone seemed to be waiting for what would happen next. Marcus could feel the tension shifting, but he didn't know if it was in his favor or not. The woman shot him a sharp look. "Is that what you call this?" She gestured around the room, to the officers, to the stunned employees, to the customers still frozen in place. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks like a disaster." Marcus swallowed hard. The tension hadn't lessened, it had simply shifted. The people who had called the police on him were now the ones under scrutiny. But just as he was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn in his favor, the woman's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the screen, her eyes widening slightly. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Oh," she murmured, "this is bigger than I thought." Marcus's pulse quickened. Whatever had just happened, whatever news had just reached her, it was about to change everything. The woman's expression stayed unreadable for a moment, her eyes scanning whatever was on her phone screen. Then with a slow breath, she lifted her gaze to the store manager. "Do you have any idea how quickly this is spreading?" she asked, her voice controlled but sharp. "There are already thousands of views on the video, and it hasn't even been an hour." The store manager's face paled. The saleswoman shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the exit like she wanted to disappear. Even the security guard, who had stood by in silence for most of this, looked shaken. Marcus's heart pounded. He had known the crowd outside was watching, but he hadn't realized just how fast the story was moving. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. This had become bigger than him. The woman turned back to him, her expression serious. "Marcus, right?" she said. He nodded. "I need you to understand something. The company will be addressing this immediately. What happened to you was unacceptable." She shot another glance at the store manager. "And people will be held accountable." The store manager's mouth opened slightly like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. The power had shifted entirely, and he knew it. Marcus let out a breath, his shoulders feeling lighter, but only for a second. Because even with everything happening, even with people finally paying attention, one thought still lingered in his mind. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady. The woman tilted her head slightly, listening. How many other people have been treated like this? How many walked away feeling humiliated because no one was watching? The store fell silent. It was a question no one wanted to answer. The woman nodded slowly, her gaze heavy with understanding. "You're right," she said, "and that's something we need to fix." The weight of her words hung in the air, but before anyone could respond, another voice cut through the room. "We want to hear it from Asterisk the Masterisk." Marcus turned to see a man from the crowd stepping forward, phone still in hand. "It's great that corporate wants to fix this, But what about the people who started it? He asked, eyes flicking to the saleswoman and the security guard. Are they going to own up to what they did? The crowd murmured in agreement. The tension shifted again, not toward Marcus this time, but toward the very people who had put him in this position. The saleswoman's face was pale now, her hands gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her standing. She looked at the store manager, then at the woman from corporate. Her lips parted, but no words came out. And then something no one expected happened. The security guard, the same man who had stood firm against Marcus moments ago, cleared his throat and stepped forward. He hesitated, then exhaled. I should have spoken up. His voice was quiet, but the room had gone so still that every word was heard. I saw what happened. I knew it wasn't right. The saleswoman's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. The store manager looked like he had just been struck. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. This wasn't the turn he had expected. The security guard looked at him now. I'm sorry, man, he said. And this time, it wasn't forced. It wasn't something he was saying just because people were watching. It was real. But before Marcus could respond, the saleswoman suddenly turned on her heel and rushed toward the back of the store without another word. The door swung shut behind her, leaving the store in stunned silence. The woman from corporate side shaking her head. Well, she said, rubbing her temple. That's one way to handle it. A beat passed before someone in the crowd muttered, guess she didn't want to apologize. A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Marcus just stood there, taking it all in. The moment he had walked into this store, he had never expected any of this. He had expected to buy a necklace, maybe find the perfect gift for his mom, and leave. Instead, he had been forced into a fight he never asked for, a fight that had now taken on a life of its own.